So the push and pull factors of migration, right, and displacement, like I've said before, and I'm sure you all have heard this, that migration is nothing new, especially as people of faith, right? Migration is something that's been happening since biblical terms, right? But some of the things that continue to displace and push people out of their homes is something that is going to continue happening, especially when we have wars, when we have climate change, right? The Ukraine-Russia war is still happening. The climate change, a lot of my colleagues were just at COP, and one of the big topics there was climate change and migration. And I thought it was interesting, the aspect of thinking about climate change affecting us in the US as well. They talked about, that climate change could, it's not a matter of if it'll happen, it's a matter of when. A lot of states are going to potentially, because of climate change, are going to displace people. And you're going to, maybe not you, but people are going to be forced to move and leave and migrate. So thinking about shifting our thinking around what migration means, right? And then all of these other factors, government instability, economic crisis, violence, whether it's gang-related, gender-based violence, being persecuted because of your religious views, being persecuted based on your sexual preferences, and poverty. These are all factors that not necessarily, it could be a number of factors that affect someone to push them out of their country. And oftentimes when I talk to asylum seekers or migrants on the ground, right, it's more than one thing. So they'll say something like, well, if, I'm a farm worker and now because of, the weather's not that great anymore, so we can't make enough money to feed our family, right? So those are like compounding factors that affect or push people out of their homes. And a lot of people don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave their family. It's hard for them to leave everything they know behind and leave. So just thinking about all of that. And then there are pull factors as well. It's real that people might already have family here, friends they want to reunite with. Maybe, again, this ideal American dream where they hear that there's economic opportunity here, which is true, right? We have a huge labor shortage right now. So the jobs, it's true. There are jobs for people that America can't fulfill right now. And even the declining population, there's information out there that without migrants, our population is declining very fast, and that we actually do need immigrants to help keep up with that population. And then, seeking safety and freedom, which who wouldn't seek safety and freedom, right? So just thinking about all the reasons people leave, and if they do leave their homes and make that journey on land and they end up at our southwestern border in the US and Mexico, the way that they can claim asylum legally, right, under the definition of United States laws, the asylum definition is the same definition as a refugee, but there are differences. But the refugee definition, which is also asylum definition, you have to be someone who is unwilling or unable to return to your home country because of a past persecution, or you have a well-founded fear of a future persecution, right? That if you're returned back, you're going to be persecuted. There's a possibility that you feel for your life and that if you're returned, something will happen to you. But it has to be on account of these 5 things: your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, which immigration lawyers will tell you all about. It's very complicated and a different avenue to try to seek fit in maybe people that wouldn't fit in these other boxes. But keeping that definition in mind, what differentiates asylum from refugees is that for asylum, you have to be physically present in the United States, or you have to have arrived in the US, whether you enter through a port of entry or outside of port of entry, you can still claim asylum. That is still currently the law as it is, right? So when you hear people saying like you entered illegally or the wrong way, once you're in the US, you still have that right. It's a human right to seek or claim asylum. So just keep that definition in mind as I talk about the policies that have changed over the past year. And just think about how all these policies are kind of changing that way of seeking asylum. And so one of the big things that happened last year in January, the very first thing that was announced was the CBP-1 mobile application, which requires people to make an appointment in order for you to have an immigration official process your asylum claim or for you to access asylum, right? And so this CBP-1 app, initially they had 1,000 appointments available for the entire 2,000-mile southwestern border, right? And only 8 port of entries were being used out of the 13. Only 8 of them were being used to process these appointments. Right now, they increased it. There's 1,450 appointments available a day. And the data says that 360,000 appointments within the last year were processed. However, there was many problems with this app when it came out, technical glitches. It was only available like in Spanish or in English. There's other languages that people speak that weren't available to them. You have to take a picture of yourself, and there was like technical glitches for people of darker skin. It wouldn't capture them. Until this day, I saw about, I think, maybe a week or 2 weeks ago that there was still an update to CBP-1. When those updates happen, they have to delete the app and download it again. So it is a complicated situation. And this app, this idea of asking for asylum by first making this appointment is making people stuck in Mexico in unsafe places where they don't have they don't have running water, electricity, food. And the criminal organizations in Mexico are still taking advantage of these populations. And so all of that is not fixing still the issue. Another thing that was rolled out in conjunction with the CBP-1 app was this parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguan. And however, that program requires you to have a sponsor in the U.S., to have money to pay, tickets, to have money to pay for background checks, and that you have the time to wait for your parole to be approved. So if you are, fleeing persecution, you're in danger, and you need to leave right away. So this program would kind of exclude those people, right? So just think about like who would have access to that. And then they also implemented regional processing centers. They want to, I think they opened one in Colombia and one in Ecuador, where it would inform people of the different avenues they would have before they embark on this long journey. So those are kind of things that were implemented as solutions. They're still kind of happening today. End of Title 42 was in May, was another big thing that, was all over the news because mainly I kept hearing that people were, making this rhetoric that once Title 42 ended, there would be an invasion of all these asylum seekers that would rush to the border and try to enter. However, I live in the Valley. Texas Impact staff came down to the Valley with me, and we were down there talking to people, interviewing people, and we have documented evidence on video that there was no invasion. Because, according to the asylum seekers we talked to, they knew that something was changing, the laws were changing, but they didn't know what was changing. They were unsure, they were unclear. So every time I talk to asylum seekers, they always tell me we want to do it the right way. We want to, follow the law. And since they didn't know what this change in law meant for them, they actually stayed put in Mexico because they were afraid that if they did something different, that it would affect them or their chance to claim asylum in the U.S. So it was the actual opposite effect of what was being put out in the media. So once Title 42 ended, we reverted back to Title 8, which is the way that asylum processing at the border has functioned. And Title 8 requires that asylum officers screen people for a credible fear of persecution or fear of returning back to their home countries. It's kind of like a mini asylum claim. because the standard's a little bit lower. It's just if you have like a viable potential claim in the US. If you do, then they will release you with the notice to appear, which puts you in deportation proceedings with immigration court. So you're not just kind of free to go. You still have to keep showing up to court and defend yourself. And eventually, if you do file an asylum claim and you win, then you have an avenue. If you don't, then you're deported. But under Title VIII, it works in conjunction with expedited removal. If that asylum officer, that credible fear interview, they find you not credible, then you're you're deported expeditiously. And that deportation comes with a 5-year ban from re-entering the country. And if you try to re-enter again, then they can federally prosecute you and you can serve time. And then the second deportation would be a 10-year ban from returning to the US. And then the other thing that was rolled out was this asylum transit ban rule, which meant that if you came to the US and you had to have asked for asylum and been denied in another country. Otherwise, you would not qualify for asylum in the US. So all of these rules, right? I see a lot of faces that look confused, and rightly so. So imagine like asylum seekers who don't know our system, right? What this all looks like to them. So, and now, of course, we have now ongoing Congress negotiations around, right, funding certain things in exchange for changing the way asylum claims are handled at the border. They want to make it more difficult for people, and they want to actually get rid of the parole program or something like that. So all of that is kind of ongoing right now. But all of these rules, right, just think about like how all of them kind of are changing the way that asylum is supposed to work under the definition that I told y'all. So requiring people to wait or ask for it in their home countries. So it's something to think about. And here is this graphic that's actually a good interactive, this is an interactive graphic from a New York Times opinion article from a fellow at Hopkins University. And the title is Fixing Our Immigration Crisis, something like that. But you can look it up and read it, and it's interactive. So each line here, it actually like goes line by line and it gives you information on it. But what I want to point out to highlight here in the interest of our time together is encounters by U.S. and Customs Border Protection. Sorry, CBP stands for Customs and Border Protection. So this is their data. And according to their data last year, in 2023, there was 2.5 million encounters with Customs and Border Protection at our land border, at the southwest border. Out of the 2.5 million, 1.9 million were processed under this Title VIII, which I described as the credible fear interviews. Out of the 1.9 million, 1.5 million cases were deemed credible and were put into the immigration court. So those cases were added to an already backlogged immigration court. Right now, immigration court is backlogged with a little over 3 million cases. And there's 686 immigration judges handling those cases, which puts them at about a caseload each of like 4,500 cases, which is insane. But this is also to highlight that we don't have open borders, right? There's a process that was followed here. And as you can see, it says, according to this, 870,000 people were deported, expelled, voluntary departure, or removed under expedited removal. So it's not, when you hear that rhetoric of we're having open borders at the border and there's an invasion, the data shows itself that there was a process that was followed. So just something to think about. And I encourage everyone to look up this article and read it and look at the interactiveness of it. But like I talked about earlier, we looked at the legal definition, we looked at data, and we talked about policies. And so just to humanize it back, to talk about the people affected on the ground, And this is specifically for the Valley. There's people waiting at bridges, ports of entry. Most recently, earlier this month, I went to the Progreso Bridge, which is the tourist bridge. That place, has shopping places, restaurants, medical facilities, dental facilities. People there, locals and non-locals, visit. And now that port of entry is lined up with asylum seekers, mainly from Ukraine and Russia, which is something new. And the year that I lived there, I had never seen asylum seekers lined up there. They're at other ports of entry as well. But I talked to a woman there who said she had been trying to get a CBP-1 appointment for 3 months, and still there was nothing for her. So, and again, it's something that's real, and people are there with no water, no food, and no access to shower facilities. So just thinking about that. At the Matamoros encampment, there's still people there as well. Right now, the Mexican immigration officials have ramped up their deportation of them. So Mexico actually started deportation flights from Mexico to Venezuela. And a lot of asylum seekers in Mexico at the Matamoros encampment were reporting that there was people, going out, trying to work in Mexico because they need to fund their cell phones for the data to be able to keep applying for the CBP-1 appointment. And now the immigration officials in Mexico are deporting people out of the area while they're waiting for CBP-1 appointments. The criminal organizations are real too. There's people there that are being kidnapped. So all of that, factors to think about. But I want to highlight the NGOs that are on the ground in the Valley that keep doing the work and meeting the necessities or the needs or the gaps where our state and federal governments don't. So all of these organizations, Team Brownsville, the Sidewalk School, La Posada, Humanitarian Respite Center, and a number of others are stepping in and providing people with what they can, with food, with water, with clothing. A couple of weeks ago, there was the cold weather came and a lot of people or in these organizations stepped in and, brought people blankets, coats, and heaters and try to help people survive. And if you come to a Courts and Ports event, we visit these shelters, we visit the encampments in Mexico. We also get a legal presentation from a legal organization at the border to give y'all an overview of the legal stuff and the work that they do. We also go to immigration court and shadow immigration court proceedings so you can see for yourself why there's a big backlog. And we also get a presentation from Border Patrol agents. So you have an opportunity to hear their aspect and ask questions as well. So all of that is something that we do with Courts and Ports and for people to, witness, discern, and reflect on the realities of what's happening. And so with that, I'll segue into the short video that Texas Impact filmed at the end of Title 42 back in May. We talked to local organizations on the ground that are doing the work and, talking about here, you'll hear about the rhetoric of invasion, why it's dangerous, and what the border communities need instead of more militarization. And then Sarah's gonna go ahead and talk to us about Operation Lone Star and SB4.
Things that I hear at the Capitol, very much so, a lot of the uses of the words of invasion and crisis and this type of rhetoric, it creates this image of the Valley as they even call it a war zone.
Are border towns being invaded? Are women and children afraid to walk the streets at night? No.
We're one of the safest communities in the entire U.S., but yet they still create more enforcement in our community.
So all these words are used intentionally to create this negative image and kind of encourage people to think that further border security is the answer that we need or what we're asking for, which is not it at all.
If you don't live here, you don't have an understanding of how immigration works.
We've been seeing an increased amount of policing. So we see several bodies or entities of law enforcement coming in through surveilling our streets. And so, being a community of mixed families, and it kind of creates a fear in the people here.
I could say that growing up undocumented and with undocumented family members, having the local police, the local sheriff's department, the Texas state troopers, having also ICE, having Border Patrol, having Customs, having the Texas National Guard, having the FBI, and all of these other agencies in one central region makes people feel uncomfortable and unsafe.
What communities have mentioned or amplified over and over again is that what they really need is more funding for things that help make the community safer.
Proper drainage, proper roads, proper lighting, public lighting, as well as like healthcare.
We know that we need to also invest in our education. When we have schools across the U.S. that are falling apart.
Do border towns need more resources to care for people who arrive? Yes. But it's not because we're drowning in fear and crime.
More resources for all of those things are things that would actually help the community and asylum seekers.
Immigration law and policy is not easy to digest, so really give her kudos to giving that great overview of some of the federal updates and what's happening at the border. Again, as I mentioned, I'm Sarah Cruz. I am the Border and Immigrant Rights Strategist with the ACLU of Texas, and I'm going to be talking today about immigration enforcement, specifically Operation Lone Star and SB4. With a quick show of hands, who's heard of Operation Lone Star, and not just from this presentation? All right, here we go. What about SB4 from 2023? Okay, so we have kind of a general familiarity with both of them. So we'll just cover some quick highlights about the current state of Texas. Operation Lone Star. What is Operation Lone Star? Its impacts, the cost. You all might have seen that big number of $10 billion. SB4, issues with SB4, the impacts or possible impacts of SB4. We won't go too much into Know Your Rights under SB4, but we can just touch on it a little bit. And then lastly, what can you do to combat Operation Lone Star, SB4, and really the anti-immigrant narrative that's happening around the state of Texas. So, like they mentioned in the video, one of the things that we're constantly hearing, invasion. What's happening at the border? It's an invasion. This is very harmful and dehumanizing narratives about our immigrant communities, migrants who are arriving at the border, and just paints the border and border communities in a much different light than what we really know it. Fabi, like she said, she lives in the Rio Grande Valley. She was there at the end of Title 42. I'm also from the Valley, and this is not something that I've seen over the last 4 years. We've never felt unsafe in our communities. But we have elected officials who tell us that our communities are unsafe. We're seeing over-policing in border communities. If you're driving through Kinney County, if you're driving through Maverick County, Hidalgo County, you might see a heavier presence of DPS as you're driving throughout there. I recently went to Del Rio, and I was pulled over for a traffic stop. And I was pulled over by DPS and a Florida law enforcement officer. And so this happens, right? The escalation of attacks on our border communities. You all might have seen what happened in Shelby Park recently over in Eagle Pass. Fabi and I were there to support one of the border vigils, and we saw the DPS presence there. We had to wait for the National Guard to let us into Shelby Park, which is, again, a state overreach on enforcing immigration law. And Operation Lone Star. What is exactly Operation Lone Star? In short, Operation Lone Star, or OLS, is a multi-billion, 10 billion enforcement operation started by the state of Texas, specifically Governor Greg Abbott, in March 2021. The operation's stated mission is to combat the smuggling of people and drugs into Texas and detect and repel illegal crossings. While Operation Lone Star, OLS, is multi-billion, it's also multifaceted. These two top pictures are pictures that Fabi and I took when we were at Shelby Park. That National Guard truck is in front of Shelby Park. Those DPS troopers you see, that's under the bridge in Shelby Park. You also might have seen some of the buoys. These are all aspects, all different facets of Operation Lone Star. The buoys, deployment of Texas National Guard and DPS officers to the border and border communities, the targeting, arrest, detaining, and prosecuting of migrants, the busing. You all might have seen videos of individuals arriving in Martha's Vineyard at DC. That's part of Operation Lone Star. And lastly, the state border wall that Texas is building, that we're investing in. So these are the different aspects of Operation Lone Star. It's a lot. There's also multiple agencies that are involved in Operation Lone Star. Just going through them, it's DPS, state troopers, Texas Military Department, that's the National Guard, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Office of Court Administration, Texas Parks and Wildlife. They've also been part of the scheme of, targeting migrants. They have been arrested after being reported by Parks and Wildlife Department, the U.S. Border Patrol, municipal police departments and local sheriffs, like those in Kinney County. And as I mentioned, other states besides Texas have been involved in Operation Lone Star. Governor Greg Abbott sent a letter to multiple governors asking for them to bring their resources to Texas so that they can combat, what's happening at the border. Some of those are Arkansas, Florida, no surprise, Iowa, Idaho, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming. So there are resources from other states here. As I mentioned, there are law enforcement officers from other states here. Hopefully you don't have to encounter them, but if you're driving through a border city, it's a possibility. I've been pulled over twice in a border community recently. One of them was for a merge that I didn't signal. So these are the traffic stops that people are encountering. I should also probably be a better driver, but I'm just gonna say. And so one of the questions that people might have is, how has Texas been allowed to do this, right? How has Texas funneled so much resources, so much manpower into Operation Lone Star? One of the ways that they've done this and have been able to divert resources is with the disaster declaration. It allows the state of Texas to access a lot of that available state and local resources that might have been used for other things that our community needs, and now it's being put towards border security. One of the most harmful aspects, though, I think, of Operation Lone Star is if you're a migrant, if you're coming into the United States and you're arrested in one of the counties that has a local disaster declaration, the penalty is enhanced. So I am not a lawyer, but I just know that penalty will be enhanced if you're arrested. And one of the most common things that migrants are being prosecuted for is criminal trespassing. What often happens is, so we know that when you arrive at the border, if you turn yourself into Border Patrol, you can make a claim to asylum that you have a fear of persecution. However, what's happening is migrants who are arriving believe that they're turning themselves into Border Patrol, that they're turning themselves over to law enforcement to make the claim to asylum. But what has been reported is that law enforcement is funneling people, like in Kinney County, to private property so that they can be arrested for criminal trespassing. I know. This is Texas. And there are currently 58 counties included in the disaster declaration. It was a lot, so I didn't want to list them out here, but if you send me an email, I can send you that link. And so why is Operation Lone Star so horrific? This is the arresting and I believe organizations call it the arrest and detain program, right? But because it creates this separate criminal system. So when someone is arrested under Operation Lone Star, they're placed into temporary processing centers that are just dedicated to OLS cases. Their case is placed onto a separate court docket with judges that are specifically assigned to OLS cases. Magistration, your first hearing in front of a judge or a magistrate judge is conducted by video in one of these temporary processing centers, and then you are transferred to one of 3 jails that have been cleared out by the Texas Department of Emergency Management that are just for individuals who are being held under Operation Lone Star. 2 of those are in the Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, and 1 is in Dilley, one of the former places of a horrible detention center. And Dilley, Texas, yes. And so some of the impacts of Operation Lone Star, like I mentioned, individuals are getting criminalized for migrating to the U.S. As Fabi mentioned, there's a numerous reasons that people are migrating to the U.S. seeking safety, reunification with family, or just really trying to find a better life, maybe economic. That's the reason. So human and civil rights violations, restricting access to asylum, over detention, meaning you are detained after Texas law has mandated your release. You may have, your case has been dropped, or you made bail. The ACLU has a current lawsuit for over detention. There have been reports that individuals, their cases have been dropped. They're held in court for much longer, and oftentimes what happens is you are transferred back to federal custody. So you're not really released into the public. You're, I don't want to say handed, but you're transferred over to federal authorities. Due process violations, oftentimes people who are arrested will sit in jails for weeks without any formal charges being brought forth. And racial profiling. If you see over here on the left, one of the state trooper presence has increased in Latino majority counties. You'll see that increased 55% in Latino majority counties, declined 7% in white majority counties. So racial profiling is very rampant in border communities. OLS has also been linked to 74 deaths and 189 injuries related to DPS pursuits. I do want to point out that although this is the deaths related to DPS pursuits, we have to remember that any policy that restricts access to asylum that is a pushback is very harmful to people who are arriving at the border. Oftentimes, if people will make efforts to avoid law enforcement, to avoid capture, and will take more dangerous routes into the U.S., often resulting in their death or disappearance. And a lot of the times, people are never found if they go missing in the borderlands. I don't have the statistic right in front of me, but that number is estimated to be about 8,000 over the last 20 years. And that is a significant undercount for organizations have stated this is a significant undercount of the deaths and disappearances that have happened at the border. And then lastly, another impact of Operation Lone Star is the chilling effects that it's had for mixed status families and undocumented families throughout border communities and throughout Texas. This is a fear. If you are pulled over and you catch maybe law enforcement officer on a wrong day and they call Border Patrol, they call ICE, that's it. That your family is separated. That is done. And now with SB4, that will be allowed throughout the state of Texas. And we'll get into that in just a second. And then last thing on Operation Lone Star, the cost. $10 billion. Reminder, Operation Lone Star was started in 2021. It's going to be the 3rd anniversary of Operation Lone Star. And the Texas legislature has authorized, the first 2 years was $4.5 billion, and they have authorized, I believe, another $4.5 billion for 2023 or 2024 to 2025. I need to get the dates correctly, but that's how much Operation Lone Star is costing the state of Texas, which is nearly $2.5 million a week. We're undertaking border wall construction, And in some areas of the border, construction costs $25 million a mile. Think about how long our border, we do have a federal border wall, but think about the missing components, missing areas that the federal border wall, and Texas is trying to fill in those gaps. So if you think about Texas, how big it is, and the border that we share with Mexico, that's a lot of miles. And lastly, this really signifies just how much money we're putting into border security in Texas. One of my colleagues was able to summarize this very, very well and say that hate is expensive. Funding hate is expensive. And so our border security funding has increased from less than 110 million, just about less than 20 years ago, to nearly 3 billion. So, but yes, I know this is not the happiest of topics, but we'll go ahead and jump into SB4. So what is SB4? I do want to point out, though, there are 3 SB4s. There's SB4 from 2017. There's SB4 from the 3rd special session, which enhances the penalties for smuggling. That was passed during the 3rd special session. And now we have SB4 that was passed during the 4th special session of the most recent Texas legislature. That's the one that we're talking about today, the big bad one, right? And so what exactly is SB4? It's one of the most extreme anti-immigrant laws that we've ever seen passed in the United States. What this will do is it will allow law enforcement officers, not just DPS, any law enforcement officer throughout the state of Texas to arrest and detain individuals they suspect of entering the country outside an official port of entry. SB4 will also grant certain judges, or it might require them in certain cases, to issue orders of deportation. One of the most concerning aspects of authorizing certain judges is this can happen at your magistration. As I mentioned earlier, this is that first appearance in front of a judge where you're given your charges. In Texas, it is not required that you are granted counsel at magistration, and magistrate judges will be allowed to issue orders of deportation at that time. So, what exactly is SB4 doing? It's creating 3 new state penalties: one for illegal entry, one for illegal re-entry, and then a refusal to comply with an order of deportation. And we'll go over illegal entry and illegal re-entry very quickly. Illegal entry and illegal re-entry. I do want to also point to the fact that these are already penalties under federal immigration law, 1325 and 1326, illegal entry and illegal re-entry. For illegal entry, that is if you're suspected of entering outside of an official port of entry, punishable by up to 6 months in jail. And there are some defenses for illegal entry. You have to be lawfully present in the United States. You've been granted some form of federal relief, so you are legally present in the United States. You are granted asylum. You have to be granted asylum, though. You can't, if you are in the process of seeking asylum, that is not a defense. You have to have already been granted. And then the other defense is if you are a DACA recipient. Now, for illegal reentry, that is if you attempt to enter, or are found anytime inside Texas after having already been removed or denied admission. That is punishable by up to 10 to 20 years, and there is no defense for illegal reentry. Even if you want to claim asylum, that is not a defense. Refusal to comply with an order of deportation. So if you are found, if the judge finds probable cause that you are in the United States, that you entered in the United States illegally or re-entered illegally, that is punishable by up to 2 to 20 years if you refuse to return to that foreign country that you entered through. One of the things that we have been educating our communities on is that, and this is try to dispel some of the fear that we have been hearing. We have been getting a lot of questions, the ACLU, about what's going to happen to me. I don't have papers, or I am a U.S. citizen, but my husband does not have documentation. What's going to happen? So there is a lot of fear. We have been reminding people that the law does take effect March 5th, but that also it's prohibited in certain locations, public, private, primary and secondary school, churches or places of worship, healthcare facilities, and safe, ready facilities. That's where they provide services to individuals who are survivors of assault, I believe. And so, what are the issues with SB4? Right? It's unconstitutional. Only the federal government has the authority to make and enforce immigration law. This was reinforced by the Supreme Court back in 2010. Some of you might recall SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law in Arizona. And so the U.S. struck aspects of that down, finding that, again, federal law, immigration law can only be enforced by the federal government. Second, it interferes with the ability to apply for relief. During the hearings where SB4 was being discussed, there was questions about how this was going to work if an individual comes in and wants the right to seek asylum. There was no answer for that. And so it interferes with that asylum process. Third, law enforcement officers and magistrate judges that are enforcing SB4, this is not their wheelhouse. This is not their expertise. That, again, is why it is under it's the power of the federal government to enforce immigration law. And then lastly, it lacks a lot of clarity on how SB4 will be enforced. The ACLU is getting a lot of questions, and it may look differently throughout the border and throughout the state of how SB4 will be enforced. So it's unfortunate that we can't answer that question, but it's a mystery to all of us how law enforcement will enforce it throughout Texas. But we do have an idea of what might actually happen, right? It's going to codify OLS. It's going to exacerbate the issues, the human and civil rights violations that we have seen happen already under OLS. It's going to increase racial profiling. It's going to get more people into our jails, and it's going to continue making it a more hostile environment for border communities, for immigrants who are arriving at the border. And like I mentioned, if you saw those pictures of DPS and the National Guard, that's real. Those are not just pictures that we're taking. This is in our communities. And then lastly, this puts our communities at increased risk of being prosecuted under SB4. Like I mentioned, we don't know how this is going to be enforced throughout the state of Texas. Law enforcement officers in one community, maybe they're friendlier than others. So there's just a risk for everyone who may get stopped and who may get funneled into prosecution under SB4. One of the things that ACLU is doing is we're conducting Know Your Rights presentations in border communities. So if that's something that you would like to do for your congregation, I invite you to connect with us so we can collaborate and educate everybody so that we can, again, dispel some of the fear that's happening, because people do have rights if they are stopped by police, and they do have the right for access to counsel. And what can you do? Advocacy. Meet with your elected officials. Tell them your concerns about Operation Lone Star, about SB4. Ask them, why aren't we funding the schools? Why aren't we funding more of those roads? Why are we funding it to border security and targeting these communities? Second, testify. Our counties are going to play a huge role in this, and so talk to your city, talk to your county commissioners, talk to your city officials, because this is not something that is just for DPS. Again, all law enforcement officers are authorized to enforce SB4. You can also organize and mobilize. Our organizations are hosting events throughout February. We're going to be at the Capitol in March. So we invite you, again, to connect with us and figure out how you can get plugged into some of these. Like I mentioned, joining events with your organizations. And then lastly, educate your communities. We need them to get the information. We need to get the information out there on how they can protect themselves so that they know their rights. So talk to your congregations. And again, if you want to do Know Your Rights presentations, there's there's resources out there that can train you so you can continue to educate others about what's coming.